Luna slipped from the kelp forest into the open harbor, just as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and deepening blues. The water, cool and bracing against her sleek, whiskered face, rippled gently beneath the last wash of daylight. Around her, fishing boats, sleek trawlers, and time-worn lobster skiffs rocked softly at their moorings, their hulls creaking a familiar lullaby. Children on the quayside waved at her as she surfaced near the wooden pilings, their laughter tinkling through the sea breeze like wind chimes. For years, Luna had patrolled these sheltered waters, a silent sentinel with dark, luminous eyes that could detect even the faintest ripples of disturbance. She knew every channel marker and underwater ledge, the hidden shoals where crabs burrowed in the sand, and the deep trough where the currents pooled small fish like living pearls. Each night she glided past tiny islands of osprey nests perched on granite outcrops, past the shimmering lights of the breakwater, and around the yachts at anchor, never straying from her routine of vigilance. Tonight, however, something felt different. As she rose to breathe near the bow of a docked ferry, Luna's sensitive whiskers brushed a film on the water's surface, thin, oily, and discordant against the harbor's gentle lull. Her dark nostrils flared, tasting the acrid sting of petroleum, where once there had been only salt. Dipping her head below the surface, she followed the slick with deliberate strokes, her powerful foreflippers leaving no wake as she traced its spreading edge. The harbor's usual clarity was marred by a ribbon of iridescent sheen, and Luna's heart tightened. If left unchecked, this poisonous carpet would spread to every cove, every clam bed, every seal pup's gathering place before dawn. Luna lifted her head above water and emitted a haunting, low-pitched call, half chuff, half whistle, that echoed through the harbor's still air. It was the same sound she used to bond with her pup, to summon others of her kind. But tonight, it carried urgent warning. Boat crews on the docks paused, turning in time to catch sight of her silhouette outlined against the twilight sky. A lone fisherman, silhouetted against the harbor lights, listened as her call repeated, rising in pitch and insistence. His weathered face creased in sudden concern. Without waiting for further signal, he leapt into a small skiff tied close by, calling orders to his deckhand as Luna slipped alongside, her dark eyes fixed on the spreading slick. The deckhand swung aboard, and engines sputtered to life, echoing through the calm evening. Luna led them toward the source, weaving between moored craft and beneath fishing nets still drying on wooden racks. Each powerful stroke carried her nearer the growing stain, and each call she uttered seemed to guide the boat's prow more surely than any human chart. By the time the skiff reached the old oil barge, tied at the harbor's mouth, a rusting hulk long thought decommissioned. The first wisps of vapor had darkened the water beneath its hull. Luna hovered at the bow, nose dipping into the sheen, then shot an urgent glance back at the boat, as if to say, "Here!" The fisherman nodded and turned the skiff beside the barge, radioing the harbor master, even as Luna circled the vessel, her vigilant gaze never wavering. In that dusky half-light, Luna the harbor seal had woven herself between tide and steel, a living bridge between the sea's creatures and the humans who relied on these waters. Her first night's patrol and her haunting warning call would set in motion the rescue of the harbor's fragile ecosystem before it could slip beyond hope. And as she slipped beneath the waves, leaving only ripples and echoing calls in her wake, the crews behind her prepared for the long night's work to come. Luna's sleek body carved through the darkening waters as she followed the oily trail toward the harbor's entrance. The scent of petroleum grew stronger with every powerful stroke of her flippers, and she felt the familiar tug of the outgoing tide, carrying the slick across the channel. Ahead, the old oil barge loomed like a rusting leviathan, its faded hull streaked with rust and flaking paint. Luna paused at the prow, dipping her whiskered muzzle into the water. The slick clung to her vibrissae in iridescent beads that reflected the harbor lights in bruised purples and sickly greens. She blinked slowly, absorbing the full scope of the spill's danger as it spread outward in ever-widening rings. With a sudden burst of movement, she launched herself fully from the water, arching in a graceful curve before splashing down beside the small skiff that cut through the sheen under the fisherman's beam. Her urgent chuff reverberated over the hull, and the fisherman leaned forward, squinting into the gloom. Luna's deep eyes flicked toward the barge, then back to the skiff, and she slapped the water twice with her flipper, the signal he had come to understand as, "Follow me." The engine idled, then roared higher as he cranked the wheel, steering the skiff over minutely swirling currents to skirt the slick's edge. They glided alongside the barge's weathered side, and Luna nudged the boat gently with her head, guiding it into the narrow gap between the barge and an adjacent tanker. Dripping oil sheathed the water's surface here, and as the skiff's hull scraped against the tanker's keel, the fisherman shouted into his radio, his voice hoarse with urgency, summoning tugs, containment booms, and cleanup crews. Behind him, Luna swam a slow circle, her eyes fixed on a ruptured valve near the barge's waterline where the oil was oozing in thick black ribbons. Leaning over the skiff's gunwale, the fisherman and his deckhand scanned the barge's side, flashlight beams dancing across pitted metal. Each beam revealed fresh fissures in the barge's plating, and each fissure grew darker as the oil welled out. Luna dove beneath the surface and reemerged closer to the valve, slapping the water with her flipper in impatience. The deckhand nodded, grabbed a length of rope, and climbed onto the barge's side to secure a patch kit. Luna remained beside the skiff, eyes never leaving the worker's progress, her body alert for any sudden shift in the barge's position that might signal danger. As they worked, hosing the valve with detergent to break surface tension and clamping a heavy rubber patch in place, Luna patrolled the perimeter, her head bobbing above the water with deliberate grace. Each time the coat of oil thickened around the skiff's hull, she nudged it free with a push of her nose, keeping the boat from becoming entangled in its own rescue. Under her watchful presence, the patch held fast, and the outflow slowed to a rinse of sheen. Luna allowed herself a satisfied chuff, knowing that her sharp nose and steadfast guidance had brought the crews to exactly where they were needed. As the skiff pulled back and the first containment boom uncoiled across the channel behind them, Luna slipped away into the kelp beds, her mission for the night complete, but her vigil over the harbor far from over. Luna felt the tug of the outgoing tide as she slipped beneath the surface, following the slick's shimmering edge into the narrower inlet that fed the inner harbor. The moonlight, pale and silvery, filtered through the water, illuminating swirls of viscous oil that coalesced around pilings and driftwood. Each stroke of her powerful foreflippers carried her closer to the fish-packed tide pools, where she and her pup often foraged, and with every inch, she sensed a deepening wrongness. The oily sheen had already begun to clog the filter-like whiskers of small crabs darting among the rocks, and she glimpsed stunned minnows trapped in oily films at the water's edge. Surfacing beside a floating dock, Luna exhaled in a rushing whoosh that sent spray flying across the wooden planks. A single night gardener paused in his task of securing loose crates of lettuce, grown hydroponically for local markets, his lantern casting a narrow cone of yellow light across the water. As Luna's dark silhouette slipped beneath the dock, he caught sight of the iridescent rings, spreading out like ripples of poison. Without hesitation, he dropped his lantern and raced for the long wooden gangway that led to the main pier, shouting into his radio, "Seals alerted! Oil's washed into the fish flats off Dock 7. Bring booms, pumps, everything you've got." That urgent warning set the harbor into frantic motion. In moments, two workboats, one laden with bright orange containment booms, the other with vacuum pumps and skimmer nets, put out from the central quay. Luna rose beside them, flippers skimming oily water as she nudged each boat toward the shallow flats where the slick gripped the shoreline. The boat's spotlights stabbed through the darkness, revealing patches of sticky oil clinging to the barnacle-encrusted rocks. Luna dove beneath the nearest skiff, swam alongside its hull, and slapped the water twice, her seal song of instruction, directing the crew to anchor the boom's clamps to valiant pilings. As they fumbled with heavy lines, she circled the boom's downstream end, nose tapping at the line until the deckhand heaved it taut between the two vessels. Behind them, the slick pooled against the protective barrier, but an undercurrent threatened to slip pristine water beneath the floating boom. Luna duck-dived, weaving under the barrier, to find a path where the slick was sneaking past. She paused at a gap where the waves lapped too high, flicking her tail to send ripples that lifted the boom's free edge above the waterline. A sailor on the stern hollered, "She's got a leak!" and slammed shut a clamp on the boom's float. Luna bobbed above, her dark eyes reflecting the frantic dance of spotlights, then dove again to inspect the newly tightened joint. Satisfied, she swam back to the open water, calling her low, echoing chuff that carried like a bell through the docks. Meanwhile, the second skiff idled nearby, its crew deploying a suction hose whose intake skimmed the water's surface. But the hose kept clogging with thick goop. Luna dove under the intake, nuzzling it with her muzzle and twisting her head to clear away the viscous obstruction. The operator on deck steered the nozzle closer to the floating oil, and the pump's howl grew stronger as the hose pulled in slick after slick. Luna surfaced to check their progress. A wide swath of dark water streamed into the skiff's hull, while behind them the containment boom glistened under the moon as a narrow but steadfast line dividing poisoned water from safe sea. As the night sky deepened toward dawn, Luna guided the cleanup hands from one hotspot to the next, her precise swimming pattern marking each area most in need of attention. When exhausted dock workers finally paused, dripping wet and shaken by the effort, Luna climbed onto a low quay wall, casting her sleek silhouette against the faint blush of dawn. The workboats, their holds half filled with oily residue, nosed back to the pier for offloading and refueling. Luna raised her head and gave a long, triumphant whistle, a seal's salute to a job well done, knowing that, for now, the harbor's hidden wildlife and human livelihoods were safe from the creeping tide of poison she had so fiercely bounded to confront. As the first pale flush of dawn crept across the water, the harbor was already a hive of controlled chaos. Tugboats slipped in from the open sea, their horns booming in salute to the fading night, while cranes on the docks swung into motion, hoisting heavy sections of containment, boom, and specialized skimmer equipment from waiting barges. Luna rose from the kelp beds beside the breakwater, her dark eyes reflecting the rosy light as she surveyed the scene she had set in motion. The slick, now largely confined behind floating barriers, formed a dark ribbon along the water's surface, and workers in rust-colored coveralls and bright life jackets leaned over the deck rails, studying the oily sheen through binoculars. A small command launch, its cabin painted with hazard stripes, circled Luna's position. The harbor master, a tall woman with a weathered face and determined eyes, leaned out of the door and called softly to her crew, gesturing toward the seal. Luna responded with a low whistle, paddling forward to greet them. The master held a clipboard aloft, checking off tasks. Boom anchors set, skimmer pumps operational, dispersant nozzles primed. Luna chuffed in approval and slipped beneath the launch's hull, re-emerging near the hydraulic winch where a crewman struggled with a tangle of heavy chain linked to the boom's weighted pontoons. Without hesitation, Luna swam a figure eight around his boots, letting her sleek body guide him to the open link that had fouled on a submerged cleat. He knelt to free the chain, smiling as he realized the seal had led him directly to the snag. With a heave, the pontoon closed the gap, and the boom once more formed a seamless arc around the spill's perimeter. Meanwhile, 3 skimmer boats formed a tripod pattern inside the containment zone. Their broad, rubber-edged bows skimmed the surface in unison, drawing oil into wide collection hoppers. Luna positioned herself between 2 skimmers, diving beneath each in turn to inspect the intake grates. When she detected clogging, a thin mat of viscous oil threatening to stall a pump, she scraped her chest plate along the grate, dislodging the grime so it drifted harmlessly away on a secondary current. The operators laughed in relief, thumbs flashing, thumbs up. Signals across the choppy waters, they tightened hoses and resumed their steady progress. On the distant western pier, a platoon of shoreline cleanup teams advanced along the battered rocky shore, where salt marsh grasses once sheltered crabs and clams. Armed with scoops and absorbent pads, they labored to remove every trace of oil from tide pools and boulder crevices. Luna surfaced nearby, cooing to draw their attention, then swam shallow along the edge, where gentle waves lapped the barnacle-crusted stones. At a sudden gesture from her, the nearest team paused and followed her lead to a tiny inlet, where oil had pooled beneath a fallen sea oak branch. With shovels and rags, they plunged in, rubbing and raking until the water's surface shimmered free of toxin. Luna dove in after them, her body brushing the rocks to push away hidden globs, ensuring no residual pockets remained. As the sun climbed higher, the harbor master gathered the morning's reports aboard her launch. "We've recovered 90% of the visible slick," she announced, voice steady through the wind. "Thanks to our harbor guardian, we've prevented this spill from claiming the salt marsh and our shellfish beds." Luna rose alongside, whiskers quivering in the breeze, and offered a dignified chuff that seemed to echo the master's words. Mission accomplished. Yet, even as workers began dismantling barriers and cleaning equipment for transport to the disposal facility, Luna patrolled the outer edges of the former spill zone, confident but watchful. For she knew that oil, like memory, could cling to hidden corners. And as long as her sleek form glided beneath the harbor's surface, no hidden threat would escape her sentinel gaze. Luna's deep, resonant chuff rose above the hum of idling engines as the first skiff returned to the quay, laden with blackened booms ready for redeployment. Without pausing, she slipped into the water beside a second workboat that cut through the mirrored harbor surface in a silent glide. The crew aboard, 4 men in bright orange overalls, leaned over the rail, binoculars in hand, scanning the water for signs of lingering oil. Luna surfaced directly ahead of them, her eyes fixed on the dim sheen that pooled near a cluster of wooden pilings 200 feet upriver. She slapped the water twice with her flipper, their agreed signal for "this way," and then turned, coasting backward as if to beckon them to follow. The skipper, a weathered fisherman named Marco, glanced at his deckhand, who nodded before throttling the engine higher and following Luna's lead. She threaded through abandoned crab pots and beneath a gangway, where the tugs had tied off the night before, skirting past a half-sunken buoy and a web of submerged rope that could have disabled the skiff's rudder. Each time the crew hesitated, uncertain whether to turn here or skirt that shoal, Luna would dive briefly and re-emerge further along the slick's advancing edge, a living buoy marking the way. Her streamlined body cut through the water with effortless purpose, and even in the gathering dusk, her gray hide glinted like a silver arrow, pointing the boat toward the leak's source. Behind them, a third vessel, a larger barge outfitted with powerful pumps, joined the pursuit, its stern deck heaving under coils of heavy hose and spare drums of dispersant. Luna surfaced between the two boats, tossing her head as though to say, "Together, here." The barge's captain barked orders into his radio, calling for skimmers to fan out in a coordinated line. As the barge closed in, Luna surfaced again at a narrow channel where the harbor's current funneled the sheen into a tight funnel. She dipped her flippers, creating ripples that nudged the barge's bow into perfect alignment with the current, and then shot forward, drawing the skiff and the barge directly to the leak's origin. There, beneath a cluster of rusted pilings that supported a disused warehouse, a thin jet of oil spurted from a fractured pipe flange. The men gasped, some ducking instinctively at the quiet eruption of dark fluid into their light-filled wake. Luna paddled in tight circles around the leak, calling out in a series of low, urgent whistles that carried over the water. These notes, long practiced in her nightly patrols, now served to steady the crew's nerves and to focus their attention exactly where it was needed. One deckhand, his gloves slick with oil, leaned over the rail to drop a weighted patch kit through the spout. Luna dove beneath the pilings to steady the patch as it unfurled and clung to the pipe's circumference. Within minutes, the leak was cradled by rubber and resin, but the sheen's fringes remained. Luna guided the skiff's bow around the pilings, nudging each floating boom section into place. She nudged the barge's intake hose toward the remaining slick, tilting it just so until the pump's roar grew louder, and the oil's dark glimmer began to disappear into the vessel's hold. As the final collector bowls filled and the skiff's deck became slick with reclaimed oil, Luna surfaced to gauge their progress. The crews, soaked and exhausted, offered her claps on the hull and murmured thanks as they began to steer back toward the main harbor, confident that with Luna's guidance, they had quelled the spill's worst threat before dawn could break. By the time the pale fingers of dawn stretched across the harbor, Luna was already at the center of a vast cleanup operation. The orange-clad crews had multiplied tenfold overnight, Skimmer boats crisscross the water in systematic patterns. Containment booms ring the spill zone like defensive walls, and high-powered pumps at the quayside hummed as they drew oily water into waiting barges. From a low quay wall near the shipyard, Luna surfaced and raised her head in greeting, her dark eyes scanning the orchestrated bustle. Crane hooks swung heavy nets of absorbent pads from deck to dock, where workers dunked them into the slick, wrung them out, and heaped them into drums. Each drum, once full, was sealed and labeled for safe disposal. Luna paddled alongside a small launch that had become her command center. The harbor master stood at its stern, clipboard in hand, issuing directives into a handheld radio. He pointed toward three distinct zones: primary spill, secondary spread, wildlife rescue sector. And Luna bobbed her head, leading the way as they steamed toward the wildlife rescue area along the salt marsh fringes. There, biologists and waders in wetsuits waded through shallows where once vibrant eelgrass meadows lay mottled with black film. A line of volunteers knelt at the water's edge, gently scooping shiny tarballs from clumps of marsh grass and placing them in buckets. Luna swam ahead, then dove, surfacing beside a cluster of stunned clams, whose shells gaped open in distress. With precise nudges of her muzzle, she pointed the volunteers to each holed shell, guiding them to clean the animals with gentle brushes and to transfer them to clean seawater tanks on the dock for rehabilitation. As they worked, the harbor master's voice crackled over the radio, coordinating simultaneous efforts. More skimmers here, stronger pumps there, and a fresh supply of sorbent booms for the northern channels. Meanwhile, the mayor and local news crews arrived aboard a ceremonial launch, cameras rolling as they recorded Luna's involvement in the rescue. The mayor bent over the railing to address reporters. Thanks to our guardian seal, we were able to confine this spill, rescue our wildlife, and protect our bayside economy. Luna reminds us that human industry and marine life must thrive together. Luna, hearing her name, lifted her head and let out a clear whistle that echoed across the rippling water, a sound that rippled through the morning's air like a rallying cry. As the day brightened, the last of the sheen was corralled into collection zones. High-pressure hoses sprayed sections of floating boom to rinse away residual oil, while tugboats towed scrap booms for onshore filtration. Luna patrolled the cleanup barges, inspecting each intake grate to ensure no nascent patches remained. At midday, the harbor master called a halt to the initial phase. Over 90% of visible oil had been removed, dozens of affected creatures rehabilitated, and sensitive shorelines scrubbed clean. Crews cheered and waved at Luna as she popped her head above the water, the living emblem of the harbor's salvation. By mid-afternoon, cleanup vessels were departing, their holds full and decks washed. The harbor master released a final broadcast. Containment complete. Monitoring continues, but the waters are safe once more. Luna slipped beneath the surface one last time, her silhouette vanishing among the kelp forest beyond the breakwater. And as the tide carried away the last traces of the spill, the harbor settled back into its steady hum, forever marked by a night of crisis, but saved by the courageous seal whose vigilance and guidance had turned potential disaster into a testament of cooperation between human and marine life alike. As the sun set on the final day of cleanup, the harbor rested once more beneath a burnished sky, its waters calm where turmoil had reigned only nights before. Luna surfaced near the end of the long wooden pier, her sleek body breaking the surface in measured grace. All around her, the subtle ripples carried the reflections of newly installed wildlife-friendly buoys and floating debris nets, permanent reminders of the spill and the safeguards now in place. Fishermen pushed off gently in their skiffs, casting lines into waters teeming again with fish, while harbor seals vented playfully in small groups beyond the breakwater, their dark eyes gleaming with unspoken gratitude. Onshore, a gathering had formed on the edge of the salt marsh boardwalk, where families and harbor workers alike paused to watch Luna's solitary vigil. The harbor master approached with a small wooden plaque inscribed, "Presented to Luna, Harbor Guardian, Protector of Life and Livelihood." He knelt at the water's edge and placed the plaque on a weathered piling, securing it with a length of braided rope. Luna drifted closer, head tilted as if reading the words, whiskers rippling in the evening breeze. The assembled crowd applauded softly, their claps echoing over the water like gentle waves of thanks. Local children, faces bright with excitement, slipped into shallow pools to see for themselves how their hero swam and played. Biologists from the wildlife rescue teams offered them sealed jars of rehabilitated seagrass seeds to plant in a nearby restoration plot, explaining how Luna's early warning had spared the marsh's fragile ecology and how their own hands could help ensure it thrived. Luna watched their eager efforts, venturing briefly to nudge the youngest gardener's bucket toward a patch of bare soil, a seal's nod of encouragement. As twilight deepened, harbor lights glimmered on the water's surface, and the final crews packed away their gear in a line of skiffs heading home. Luna slipped beneath the waves to patrol her domain one last time, weaving between pilings and beneath mooring lines, checking the kelp beds she called home. In the hush of the approaching night, she surfaced by the breakwater, where stacked cranes and idle barges stood sentinel against the dark sky, silent witnesses to the harbor's narrow escape and the seal's unwavering watch. And so, Luna's legend settled into the harbor's lore, a living guardian etched into fishermen's tales, environmental reports, and the etched wooden plaque that would fade only when her story was retold by a new generation. Yet each time she surfaced at dusk, whiskers flicking, eyes glinting against the golden horizon, any doubter would see the truth, that beneath the steel and wood of commerce, it was a harbor seal's instinct and courage that had sounded the alarm and united an entire community in defense of the fragile world between sea and sky.